Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Babylon 5 Season 4 Part 2. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review every episode of Babylon 5, one season at a time. In this video, I will be covering Season 4 of Babylon 5. This video is Part 2 of 2, as I had a lot to say about Season 4, and I couldn't fit it all into one video, so this video continues on from Part 1, so I'd recommend watching that first as I give my overall thoughts of the season in that video, as well as cover the first 11 episodes. I'll put a link to that video in the description below. For this video, I'll cover the last 11 episodes of the season and give my rating of the season as a whole, as well as my picks for best and worst episodes. So without any further ado, let's jump right into the episodes, starting with episode 12, Conflicts of Interest, which I really liked because in this episode, Sheridan finally decides to fight back against the propaganda war that Clark is raging against him. I mentioned before he sent Franklin and Marcellus to Mars, but that was more to deal with the trade war. Up until this point, Sheridan has been ignoring the information war or misinformation war, which is a huge mistake, as the flow of information, in fact, is a major component of any war, as it dictates how the public views those involved, and that in turn affects a lot of things that the public sphere has influence on. And it was actually really smart of the Clark administration to paint Sheridan as the bad guy, which they do by associating him with aliens and saying he's been influenced by aliens. In other words, stoking anti-alien fears and prejudice. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? But I won't get into that here. At any rate, it was so great to see Sheridan finally decide that they need to fight these lies with the truth. So he enlists Ivanova to be the voice of the resistance, as he states it, to basically start a broadcast that will air what was actually going on. And I love how they touch on the fact that in order to broadcast to a planet light years away, they need to establish networks, which they don't have. So instead, they use the power on the planet Espelon 3, which has been established to be a big resource of theirs. In fact, it was established as their ace in the hole against the shadows, which they never actually use, which I find really disappointing, but at least they take advantage of it here, which allows for a cameo by Zathras. Even though Zathras disappeared in time, they come up with this excuse that it's his brother or something, and they're all called Zathras, which apparently slight variations and pronunciations that humans can't even detect, which allows for like some silly jokes. But in actuality, they just like Zathras, and so they just want to have an excuse to have him on the show again. And despite myself, I kind of like Zathras too, even though he is just a fantasy imp character stereotype, the way he talks all funny and about himself in the third person. But I must admit, I found his appearances humorous here. However, the episode was really about Garibaldi meeting his employer's wife, who just happens to be his former lover, and they talk about their feelings that they had for each other and what happened in the past and blah 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 blah, gag gag gag, yawn yawn yawn. I've seen this storyline a billion times before, and it's not any more interesting here. But the chase scene where the telepaths are trying to kill them was exciting and well executed, so it's not a total waste of time. But ultimately, this was actually a pretty good episode. So next episode is Rumors, Bargains, and Lies. So this episode, let me start with the Sheridan storyline because I loved this. Now, this is something I haven't really touched on yet, but I hate Babylon 5's sense of humor, and typically when they try to be funny, I don't find it funny, instead just find it silly and stupid. There are tons of examples of this, like the ritual that required a bunch of religious Minbari to just sit and listen in the next room while Delenn and Sheridan fuck, and many such examples that I think are just dumb, and I typically don't mention it because it tends to be one brief scene or line, and this review is more about having, looking at each episode in broad strokes. However, this storyline was one of the rare successful cases of Babylon 5 actually being funny, because this storyline was hilarious. Not only that, but it was very clever. So Sheridan wants the League of Non-Allied Worlds to allow him to have White Star fleets patrol their borders in order to fight against raiders and races like the Drakh, who want to take advantage of their weakened state after the Shadow War. But he knows that if he asks them outright, they will say no and suspect that he has ulterior motives when he really doesn't. He just wants to help them. But he understands their suspicious nature, and so he uses that against them and instead tricks them into asking him. Not just asking, but insisting, nay, demanding that he have the White Star ships patrol their borders. And the way he does this is hilarious by doing stuff like sending Marcus out on the White Star to shoot a bunch of asteroids for no reason, and telling Ivanova to report on her broadcast that nothing happened in the sector that Marcus was in, which was brilliant because it was the truth. Nothing did happen, but just saying it out of the blue does really make one think that he's hiding something. So they suspect that he doesn't want to help them, and plays the part and acts like they're reluctantly forcing him into it. But then once they agree, once they force him to have the White Star ships patrol their borders, once he's in private, he yells, "Yes!" And I love that. It was absolutely brilliant. But the main plot of the episode focused on the upcoming Minbari civil war. As Delenn returns home at the news, Minbari have broken out into fighting between the religious caste and the warrior caste. This is a result of Delenn dissolving the Great Council in Season 3. So again, Babylon 5 proves brilliant at maintaining continuity, but as I mentioned, I was never that big of a fan of Minbari episodes, but this one was actually pretty interesting, as Delenn meets with Neroon, the Minbari warrior class whom she had always had a feud with in the past, but their last meeting ended with him gaining respect for her, so she meets with him to try to find a path to peace, but the other religious caste on the ship thinks that she's trying to surrender, so they plan to destroy the ship. However, Lanier catches them in the act and saves the ship and nearly dies in the process, but he doesn't want to tell Delenn that her own people tried to kill her. So the peace talks do go forward, only for Delenn to find out that Neroon has betrayed her and used her to give the advantage to the warrior caste. That was a pretty dark and twisted twist. It was a really interesting story of political intrigue, so even though I don't care much for Minbari episodes, this one was actually really good. So next episode is Moments of Transition, which carries on the storyline with the Minbari Civil War, but it's not much of a war anymore, as the religious caste are on the brink of defeat. In fact, thousands of lives hang in the balance, so Delenn has no choice but to surrender. So we meet the head of the warrior caste, and he's a huge douchebag, and he arranges to have Delenn surrender in public to the entire planet watching in order to humiliate her. However, Delenn uses this against him and uses Minbari tradition to trick him into revealing the petty moron that he is to the entire planet. However, in doing so, she also planned to sacrifice herself, to which Neroon was not okay with, so he saves her and sacrifices himself in the process. I did really like this storyline. It was great seeing Delenn at her best and using her knowledge of Minbari tradition to trick this cowardly, greedy jackass into revealing his true self. And I also love that even though Neroon betrayed her because he felt an obligation to stay true to the warrior caste, he was still able to recognize that his leader was speaking out of self-interest and wasn't fit to lead the warrior caste, let alone the entire planet, and he recognized Delenn's value so much so that he was willing to give his own life for her. Now that was a powerful and very satisfying end to his storyline. Also, it was fascinating to get Delenn's solution to the new Great Council to put the worker class in charge of the Great Council and give them majority in the council, saying that, oh, you forgot about the worker class. And frankly, yeah, I did, as a viewer, because they're barely mentioned in the show. But this is the equivalent of giving power back to the people, as the worker class likely represents the common people, the workers. So I thought this was a brilliant solution as well. I also really enjoyed the storyline with Lita and Bester, as we see Lita struggle with her finances and her new situation, as she's unable to legally get any work because she's not a member of Psych Corps anymore. Now, I did find it a little hard to believe that Sheridan would just leave her out in the cold like this, not give her any pay, and even kick her out of her own room after all she's done for them. I mean, he has enough money from docking fees and stuff to pay all of his crew. It seems like she should be included in that. So I don't buy that he would do this, so it seems more like plot convenience to me. However, if I would go off what was presented in this episode, it's no wonder that Lita accepted Bester's deal and went back to Psych Corps, even though in practice she could still do whatever she wanted and was only a member of Psych Corps in name. It's still an endorsement of them as she has to wear their uniform. So I blame Sheridan for that. But I did find her scenes interesting. The stuff with Garibaldi was interesting too, when his boss refuses to let Garibaldi hire Lita to assist him. This is where we get the first hint that this guy, Edgar's, is prejudiced against telepaths. And there's also a lot of clues that Bester is using Garibaldi, although I don't think it gave away too much. It is interesting that Zack tried to hire Lita to scan Garibaldi to find out what's going on with him, but she refuses to do so because it's against her code to scan people without their permission. And this is interesting because if she had, she could have discovered the tampering that Bester did and could have been able to free him and hurt Bester and prevented him from all the crap that he does. So it does make you wonder if maybe there are cases where telepaths should override this code. And then the episode ends on an amazing cliffhanger as Ivanova obtains evidence that the Clark forces destroyed civilian ships trying to flee Proxima 3 filled with unarmed refugees, killing 10,000 unarmed men, women, and children. And this is the last straw for Sheridan, who declares all-out war on Clark and vows to take military action to free the colonies and remove President Clark from power or die trying. So that was a damn exciting cliffhanger, but honestly I do wonder why it took him so long to do it. They mentioned it's because he didn't like the idea of killing his own people or fighting his own people, but as he said, anyone who follows orders like that is guilty of war crimes, and I totally agree. In fact, even before this point, Clark was guilty of a lot of transgression in my opinion, so I think Sheridan should have acted a hell of a lot earlier. So it does seem a bit like plot convenience, but I still loved it. So next episode is No Surrender, No Retreat. Kind of like never give up, never surrender. Cool catchphrase, but not really that practical because retreat and surrender can be strategically advantaged, but that's neither here nor there. Overall, love this episode to death. This is the episode I had been waiting for ever since Sheridan broke off from EarthGov in Season 3, but don't get me wrong, it makes a lot of sense and in fact adds to the realism that it would take over a year for things to come to a head. And I absolutely love how this episode begins with you getting all the war drums and the typical suspenseful music that tells you that everyone's gearing up for war. Cliche as it may be, I still loved it and thought it really worked here. And I love how the episode begins with Sheridan meeting with the Council and the League of Non-Allied Worlds to basically declare an economic war on Earth. He tells them that they've all been getting ships, the White Star ships protecting their borders, and now it comes with a price tag, and that is if they want those ships to continue to protect them, they have to cut off all ties, trade, and military aid with Earth. And the only thing they are allowed to provide Earth with is humanitarian aid. It does make me question the use of the term humanitarian when talking to a bunch of aliens, but whatever. Point is, he's asking them to completely isolate Earth so they will be on their own. And again, it's about time he did this. He should have done this when Earth tried to isolate Babylon 5 and put an embargo on them. They should have been like, oh yeah, you want to isolate me? I'll isolate you. After all, Sheridan on Babylon 5 has easier and instant access to representatives from all the known alien worlds, so he should have have used that. But to be fair, at this stage he didn't have the advantage over all of them. But now he does because of the White Star Fleet protecting their borders, which gives him the extra strong bargaining position. Because these alien worlds may not want to cut ties to Earth because it actually hurts them as they miss out on a lot of trade. But the White Star Fleet protection gives them that extra incentive. And I wish that the rest of the season touched on this more about how Earth was damaged by this trade embargo. But again, this is probably another thing that went by the wayside when this season had to be truncated. So this was a big move against Earth, but it comes with one disadvantage, that the Clark government could take advantage of this, and that's if they could use this to feed their anti-alien propaganda and further paint Sheridan as someone under the influence of these aliens, thus painting the racial prejudice and fear. Again, another tactic we've seen in modern times, but not getting into that here. And I do assume that's what the Clark government did do, because it's totally in keeping with what we've seen of their propaganda techniques so far. So just because we didn't see any of it, again, I think it's because the season had to be condensed and we missed out on some of the more interesting nuance. I still think it happened. Anyway, most of the episode deals with Sheridan and his forces trying to take Proxima 3 by force, but he has to do it in a way with minimal loss of life as possible, because this is still the Earth forces, so he doesn't fully see them as the enemy, which I think gives him the disadvantage, which is what makes the Civil War storyline a little more interesting, because it makes it more of a fair fight or a challenge, as it would be really easy for Sheridan to get the Minbari and the White Star Fleet and just go in there, walk right over Clark's forces. He could just blow them all away and be done with it, but by doing so, he would appear to be just as evil, as bad of a tyrant as Clark was. In fact, the argument could be made that if he did do this, he would be, especially if he put himself in power. So that's not what he wants to do. He wants to keep alien involvement out of this, although he still uses the White Star Fleet, which I think is a flaw, because the White Star Fleet White Star ships use Minbari and Vorlon technology, therefore the puny Earth ships, with one exception, which I'll get to later, but the puny Earth ships really shouldn't stand any chance against them whatsoever. Because even without the Minbari help, Sheridan should have been able to walk all over Clark's forces, but whatever. We'll just go with it. But anyway, what Sheridan wants to do is a war of ideas. He doesn't just want to defeat his enemies militarily, he wants to win them over to his side, which is why we see him beforehand using Marcus to gather intelligence on which ships could possibly turn to his side and which ones are just right out their enemies. And the two ships that destroyed the civilian fleet clearly fall into the enemy category. During the actual battle, we see signs of Sheridan talking to certain captains and trying to convince them what Clark is doing is wrong, where we get the perspective of another Earth captain who is just outright an asshole and anti-Sheridan and doesn't care what he has to say. And I love how nuanced it is. I love how well this works. Although I do kind of doubt that any ships supporting these illegal blockades of Proxima 3, while a ground war is being fought there, where thousands are dying, would actually be willing to switch sides, because they already have blood on their hands, in my opinion, as they were helping to starve out that colony by cutting them off from trade. So women and children have died due to their actions. So that Mackie character, for example, that is meant to appear as a good, smart guy who becomes one of Sheridan's closest allies in a fight. What a great guy that he took Sheridan's side. He has blood on his hands. He helped participate in the murder of women and children. But anyway, apparently Sheridan is a lot more forgiving than I am, which is probably the right attitude to have in a situation like this. But regardless, absolutely love this episode. It was amazing. So anyway, Let's get to the next episode, Exercise of Vital Powers. So this episode mainly follows Garibaldi as he goes to Mars to finally meet his employer, Mr. Edgars. And as he mentioned in the previous episode, he has no intention of ever returning to Babylon 5. Da da da. And so this episode has a real dark noir feel to it, which I actually think really works well. Now this is another case of when I first was watching this episode, I didn't like it because I didn't remember the twist of what was going on with Mr. Garibaldi, and thus felt that what he was doing in this episode was completely and totally out of character for him, especially his monologues at the start and end of the episode where he says Sheridan has become an egomaniac who basically is becoming a tyrant who believes he's some sort of god or something, which is one of the dumbest statements ever made, because as I just touched on, if Sheridan was really like that, he would have just won this war in 2 minutes and would currently be sitting on his throne on Earth standing over Clark's dead body. But even not knowing the specifics of what went down in the Battle of Proxima 3, Garibaldi knows Sheridan, and so he should know better. That's just so ridiculous. But as I said, I only thought this was ridiculously out of character for Garibaldi before I knew the twist. Once I found out the twist, it all made perfect sense, and in fact works beautifully, because the point is Garibaldi is being mind controlled and his mind has been messed with, which is why he comes to these absolutely illogical, absurd conclusions. So I actually like this episode a lot now when looking at it in retrospect. Now, we did get a few scenes earlier in the season that indicated Garibaldi was being mind controlled, such as the weird transmission Garibaldi receives. And I've heard the opinion that these scenes detracted from his storyline, or it detracted from the shock of the reveal, and the show would have been better off without them, but I very strongly disagree. Just having some vague sense of him being mind controlled to me wasn't enough to excuse his odd behavior. So at this stage before the reveal, I still didn't know the extent or the purpose of the mind control, so I still maintain it didn't damage these episodes at all. So finally we meet Edgars, and it seems like he belongs in a soap opera or a Dos Equis advert or something, but whatever, I'll just have to get over that. And we do learn that he is in fact incredibly prejudiced against telepaths, and that is his main drive. His problem with Sheridan is simply that Sheridan is freaking out Clark more, and the more Clark is freaked out, the more power he gives to the telepaths. And I love that. I love how realistic and complicated this dynamic is. Edgars, who is one of the 1% of the 1%, and basically flat out says that him and the other multi-quadrillionaires are the real ones running Earth, not Clark. And if they had a problem with Clark, they'd simply take him out. And they never really had a problem with Clark until he started giving power to the telepaths. So they have a plan to deal with Clark, but is more focused on taking down the telepaths first. But Sheridan's war is making it harder for him to do this plan because it's forcing Clark to give more power to the telepath. So I love that Edgars doesn't have a problem with Sheridan directly. He doesn't even have a problem with Clark directly, but their conflict interferes with his plans to take down the telepaths, so he schemes to use Garibaldi to take out Sheridan just so he can continue his plans against the telepaths. And once that plan is complete, then he's okay for Sheridan to be set free or left alone or go back to do whatever he wants to do. And I love that. The arrogance involved there. That this is so in character for someone who is so wealthy and has been so accustomed to having all of the power, where he's like, well, this fight to stop the murder of thousands of innocent civilians and to remove a power-hungry, evil dictator who is oppressing all of humanity from power, that's a real inconvenience to me right now. So I'm just going to have to put a stop to that until it's no longer an inconvenience for me. Then you can go back to doing whatever you want. Stop the evil dictator, whatever. I don't care. Just don't inconvenience me because I'm rich and powerful. That is amazing. absolutely amazing, and I loved it. But as for the episode itself, I did really like the dark feel to it. It did really work, but it's not one of my favorite episodes, as it did move a bit slowly, and there are a few aspects with like the love triangle with Edgar's wife, who used to be Garibaldi's lover, I didn't really care for. Like when Eggers was using a telepath to tell whether or not Garibaldi was telling the truth, and when Garibaldi said that he was not still in love with Edgar's wife, the telepath revealed that he was lying. There's really no point to this. They never touched on this again. I mean, I thought they were going to go in this weird way where, Edgar's wanted to watch his wife have sex with Garibaldi to get his kicks or something really weird and twisted like that. But no, nothing ever comes to it. It's a complete waste of time. So, yeah, I don't know. But other than that, pretty strong episode. So the next episode is Face of the Enemy. Another absolutely amazing episode. I was completely blown away by this episode. This was a richly dark episode, but in a very exciting and engaging way. So this carries on the story with Sheridan making his way to Earth to free them from the dictator who currently rules there, and so far everything seems to be going his way. They freed Proxima 3 from Earth, and more Earth ships have joined their cause, and every encounter since then has gone their way, and they keep gaining more support. So in other words, victory seems assured. But like any good storyteller knows, everything going smoothly isn't very entertaining. You need your heroes to suffer a huge defeat, a huge setback, and to make the odds a lot higher in order to up the stakes. And that's exactly what this episode does. And it does it in the most impactful and powerful way. So in the previous episode, we already heard about Garibaldi's plan to capture Sheridan using his father against him, but here that plan goes off without a hitch. Now, even though we saw this coming because we were told exactly what the plan was, it was still a bit surprising that this plan actually worked, as I still didn't think the show would be as bold as to have Sheridan betrayed by Garibaldi and imprisoned by the Clark administration, but they did it, and it was spectacular. Now, I must say, I absolutely loved the scene where Sheridan met with Garibaldi, and he slapped him with that stinger that sedated him, but he still resisted and tried to fight his way out, but ended up just getting his ass kicked. I love this scene. It was so amazing. The way it was shot was absolutely excellent. Typically, I'm not a fan of like Dutch angles, but the way it was used here to show Sheridan's perspective as he was shot up with tranks worked so well to put you in his mindset, and the way it was cut with like the flashing lights of the bar was absolutely amazing. I also really loved the music. Now, granted, if it was very 90s, it was like grungy punk music with a female vocalist, but to be honest, that's actually my favorite genre of music, so it really worked for me. Even though it does kind of anchor the show as coming from the 90s, I don't have a problem with that. So then after Garibaldi has done his part, he goes to Edgar's, who had promised to tell him everything once he had proven himself. So Edgar reveals his plan to release a virus that would kill all telepaths, and only he has the cure, which telepaths would need to inject themselves with every 2 weeks or they die. And thus, he would create a slave race out of telepaths, because if they ever step out of line, they could simply withhold the antidote and let them die. Garibaldi seems okay with this, but then we see him activate a transponder in his tooth, and shortly thereafter he goes into a transport pod where he meets with Bester and tells Bester everything. It's here where we finally get the big reveal that Bester had saved him, quote unquote, from the shadows, but only so he could use him for his own purposes, and so he could alter his mind to make him more rebellious, and then just pushed him in the right direction in order to plant him with Edgar so he could find out what he was up to. So Garibaldi's primary drive, his mission, was to find out what Edgar's was up to at all costs, which explains why he was willing to set up Sheridan, because Edgar's made it clear that the only way he would reveal his plans is if he helped take down Sheridan. And Bester talked about how the real Garibaldi was still there inside of him. Instead of killing him or leaving him a vegetable, he lets Garibaldi return to normal, seeing that this could be a worse fate for Garibaldi, as he has to live with what he's done, and no one would believe him, which is true, as Ivanova ordered that all of his transmission be denied, and that if he arrived on Babylon 5, he was to be shot on sight. And this scene was absolutely amazing. This is another example of amazing cinematography, as when Bester leaves and Garibaldi returns to normal, knowing everything that just happened. The way this was acted and shot was amazing, as it really hit home with the helplessness that Garibaldi felt as he simply screamed. That was absolutely chilling. Now, I'm pretty sure this won't be my favorite episode of the show, although it will be up there in my top 10, I can assure you of that. But this scene, I will say right now, is my favorite scene of the entire episode. It was so chilling. It was so powerful. It was absolutely amazing. And Bester has always been a great villain, a good foil for our heroes, but this was the one time that he was absolutely evil in the best sort of way. And it is interesting that, like Edgar's, Bester cares nothing about Sheridan or Clark or billions being slaughtered or pressed by Clark, and he only cares about the telepaths and Edgar's and what Eggers wants to do to the telepaths. And Sheridan's captured was just a side effect that he cares nothing about. Also, it shows how faulty Edgar's plan actually was and how egotistical he was, because it turns out that the telepaths got the better of him because he was just killed. They just killed him, leaving Clark in power and Sheridan a prisoner. Because, Eggers was like, oh, don't worry, we'll free Sheridan later and we'll take care of Clark, so everything will be fine. But in actuality, his plans just fucked everyone. Dark. Truly dark. And the way the episode ends with the ISN broadcast intercut with scenes of Sheridan being beaten, where the reporter was saying Sheridan was being treated nice and with care. And thanks, Garibaldi. Thank you, Garibaldi, for your services, and you're such a hero. That was an absolutely chilling ending. The episode was amazing. Simply amazing. I have heard that the original plan before they thought the show was being canceled after this season was that this episode was meant to be the season finale. And I do think it would have made an absolutely spectacular season finale. But either way, it really works. So, next episode is Intersections in Real Time. I heard from some other people that this episode was supposed to be the season finale, but I could have sworn that JMS had said that the last episode was supposed to be the season finale, and then this episode would be the season 5 premiere. But either way, I don't think it would have worked as either one, or at least I wouldn't have cared for it, as this episode is very isolated. It just features Sheridan getting tortured, and we don't see any progression with any of the other storylines. I'm not saying that makes this a bad episode, just not a good finale or premiere, in my opinion anyway. At any rate, this episode reminds me a lot of Chain of Command from The Next Generation. In fact, I remember thinking that this seems like a good precursor to that episode, a decent torture episode that came out years before Chain of Command approved upon this format. But then I remembered that Chain of Command actually came out 5 years before this episode. Oh well. Not that I'm saying that this episode ripped off Chain of Command, because that episode itself was heavily, shall we say, inspired by films like Marathon Man in 1984, which is where I think this episode draws a lot of its inspiration from. I still think Chain of Command did it better, so it's never a good thing when a story heavily reminds you of another story, that did it better. But still, this wasn't a bad episode. In fact, the one thing I will say this episode had over Chain of Command is, unlike that episode, it did not have a happy ending, which did make it come off as a lot more dreary. Plus, it makes total sense that the dictatorship, as corrupt as the Clark administration, would use torture like this, which is based mainly on fucking with someone's head. Of course, combined with physical discomfort, lack of food and water, depriving of sleep, making him violently ill, etc., etc., but mainly it involves the interrogator playing mind games meant to assert his control and to confuse Sheridan enough to admit what they want him to admit. It doesn't work, of course, but I do love how this episode does drive home how hopeless his situation is, but Sheridan still refuses to give in, and I love when the interrogator asks him if he thinks he can really win, and he replies, "I win every time I say no." That was amazing. And then it ends on a dire note that promises eternal torture. So even though I kept expecting the interrogator to ask, "Is it safe?" and Sheridan to reply by saying, "There are 4 lights," it was still a good episode. So, next episode is Between the Darkness and the Light. Now, this was a great episode that I loved. However, it was probably the episode that most showed the signs that the story was being condensed and told over much fewer episodes than originally planned. As Sheridan was rescued in this episode, and by the end, he's back in command of the fleet. So it seems to go by really fast, but it was still a great episode. It starts off showing that Sheridan's torturers have moved on to trying to drug him, and we get a really cool scene where he thinks he's talking to Dr. Franklin. In fact, it was so good the way that they fake the audience out and make them think he's been rescued already. And I love how they keep switching from Franklin and the interrogator who's interrogating him and they keep switching from Babylon 5 to the interrogation room. It was a really effective way to show how the drugs were confusing and messing with his mind. But even when drugged and disorientated, Sheridan still refuses to give in. We then see Garibaldi go to the Mars Resistance, who don't think very kindly of him, so they beat him and bring him to Franklin to be killed. But of course, he tells him what happened with Bester, and of course no one believes him, but he asked Lita to read his mind. Now, I did find it a bit of a fake stakes when Lita and Franklin had to hold others at gunpoint just to let Lita read his mind. It seems number one was being unrealistically stubborn here, but I did like how Lita had to break through the mental blocks that should be above her abilities. But since she's been enhanced by the Vorlons, her abilities are much stronger, so she's able to prove to them that Garibaldi is in fact telling the truth. So we then get a really exciting and well-executed escape mission where Garibaldi, Franklin, and Lita break out Sheridan, which, as I mentioned, happened a bit fast, but was very exciting nonetheless. However, what they skipped over the most to me is Sheridan discovering what happened to Garibaldi and coming to terms with this and forgiving him for what he did. This is not touched on in the least, and in the next episode he's all of a sudden fine with Garibaldi again, and this is probably a side effect of the story being condensed, so we can kind of forgive it there. But we also get the story with Ivanova, as she has assumed command of the fleet and continues the fight towards Earth, stopping along the way to take on survivors and ensure there's as little loss of life as possible. But through her interrogations of some of the prisoners they captured, they discover there's an elite fleet waiting for them near Mars, and that's setting a trap for them. So instead of sending the whole fleet, Ivanova decides to take just the White Star ships so that the Earth ships that have joined them will remain safe and intact in order to make a final strike on Earth to ensure that the people of Earth see humans, not aliens, advancing on Earth. And we get some interesting interactions between Marcus and Ivanova while they are en route to remind us that Marcus is in love with her, and we see that Ivanova appreciates his affections. This, of course, becomes really relevant as when they arrive at the trap, they find that these elite ships have been equipped with shadow technology. Now, remember when I said that the White Star Fleet should have ripped through Clark's forces like ripping through tissue paper, but with one exception. This is that exception, as the fact that they were using shadow technology does give them quite an extreme advantage. So this is probably the only fight in the whole war where I'd say the stakes felt earned. In any event, the White Star Fleet does win the day, but they take heavy losses, including Commander Ivanova, who is critically wounded, and in fact, her death is all but a matter of time. And seeing her final conversation with Sheridan, where she makes him promise to lead the final assault on Earth on the Agamemnon, was very touching. I absolutely loved it. So overall, a great episode. So next episode is Endgame, which was an absolutely amazing episode. And I must say, it feels very strange for me to be saying those words. Endgame is an amazing episode. Those who watched my Star Trek Voyager videos will know why. But anyway, this is an absolutely satisfying payoff to this storyline, which so far has been extremely excellent and extremely intense, and this conclusion very rightfully is probably the best of them all. So it ends the story in the bang that it deserves. Most of the episode focuses on the battle, which interestingly enough is mostly set on Mars, as they have to go through Mars to get to Earth. But then again, Garibaldi is actively on their side and helping the Mars resistance take key installations. Sheridan's suddenly completely okay with this, but whatever. Anyway, we finally get resolution to the storyline introduced much earlier in the season when Sheridan asked Dr. Franklin to do something with the telepaths whom they rescued from the shadow vessels, something that Franklin really didn't like. But here, not only do we find out what that is, but we also see Franklin actually arguing that it needs to be done. And that is that they ship out one telepath on each of the Earth ships in the fleet waiting for Sheridan and use Leda to activate them, so they will try to merge with the ships, causing them all to be disabled. So they basically disable each ship, and this was actually pretty exciting. However, I will say that I still think in this instance Sheridan's fleet should have torn through this fleet like tissue paper, yet everyone was still talking like Sheridan's fleet was at a true disadvantage. There was no way for them to win, and they had to use these telepaths in order to gain that advantage, which is horseshit because these Clark ships have not been enhanced by shadow technology, and the White Star Fleet has Minbari and Vorlon technology, and there are Minbari ships in this fleet as well. And let me remind you, during the Minbari War, Earth stood no chance against the Minbari and basically got their asses handed to them. Sheridan was the only one to destroy a Minbari ship, and the way he had to do this by playing a trick with asteroids. So basically, no Earth ship has ever defeated the Minbari ship ever, and now Sheridan has ships with Minbari technology, not to mention Vorlon technology, but I won't even get to that, and also a fleet of alien ships, and they all have like different advanced technologies, including Minbari ships. So I can't help but feel these battle scenes were a bit contrived, but don't misunderstand me here. I am not saying that this hampers my enjoyment of this episode in any way, shape, or form, because it doesn't. I still absolutely love this. If I just go with the premise, it was exciting seeing Sheridan lay out all the pieces, and when he arrives at Earth with the fleet and he gave his heartfelt speech about how he was there to remove Clark, that was a truly great moment. It was a great get up and cheer moment. And the fact that Clark would turn the automated defense system against Earth to destroy Earth right before killing himself shows what an evil tyrant he was. And this really upped the stakes, as Sheridan's fleet had to rush to destroy the defense system before it could destroy Earth. Although, another little nitpick is how the Agamemnon was the only ship in range of the last remaining satellite, and the Agamemnon is out of ammo, so Sheridan orders the ship to ram the automated satellite. Really? The whole entire fleet of ships everywhere, all in orbit of Earth, and none of them are in range to destroy the satellite. Come on. I don't believe that. But anyway, still a great episode. So that Earth captain guy who was in charge of killing Sheridan comes in and he saves the day by destroying the satellite. So I guess I'm supposed to think he's a great guy now because he finally chose the right side at the last second, right before millions on Earth were about to be killed by the man who he was up until 2 minutes ago taking orders from. No, he's a war criminal, and his actions here don't change that. But I'll get more into this subject in the next episode. So anyway, this episode ends amazingly strong with the broadcast from ISN, the real ISN this time, after the real reporters are let out of prison, where the anchor woman is just beside herself and can't believe the tyranny is finally over. She talks about how many of her and her fellow reporters were in prison, tortured and killed by the Clark administration, and is just beside herself that it's finally over. This was a really heartwarming moment, and it brings a tear to my eyes every time I watch it. But of course, that scene was only a warm-up, because next we get into the Marcus stuff. So earlier in the episode, Lanier, like a dumbass when talking about how there's nothing to be done to save Ivanova, phrased it in such a way that made Marcus suspect that there was something that could be done to save her, but he just wasn't telling him about it. So Marcus searched Franklin's logs on Babylon 5 and found out about the alien device introduced in Season 1 that can be used to heal the sick and injured, but through draining the life force of those who use it. So, of course, Marcus gets in his head to go back to Babylon 5 and use this machine to save Ivanova. Now, when Delenn finds out about this, she contacts Sheridan, but at this stage, the fleet is making its final approach on Earth and are inside their communication jammers, so can't get a message off to Babylon 5. And the captain of the Agamemnon tells him that they have to keep going or abandon the entire mission. So Sheridan tells Delenn that there's nothing he can do, and I'm just going to have to call bullshit on this, because Sheridan could very easily spare one ship, in fact, a tiny ship, a shuttle or something, because at the start of the next episode, we see that he sent Franklin on a ship to go back to Babylon 5. There's no reason why he couldn't have sent one ship, and they don't even have to go all the way to Babylon 5. They just have to get out of the jammers range in order to get a message off to Babylon 5. It's not like he needed every little ship to go to Earth. So this, there's nothing I can do, is BS. It's a load of crap. But in any event, Marcus gets to Babylon 5, and the final scene of the episode is of him hooking himself up to the machine and using it to save Ivanova's life, which will kill him, and he simply says, "I love you." Now, I remember the scene from the first time I saw this episode years ago, and I kind of remember it has an obvious and very overt attempt at jerking my tears. I remember I liked it, but the second time I watched it, I was bracing myself, being like, okay, get ready for this cheesy, contrived attempt to make me sad. But when I watched it, I was sobbing. Like, I don't mean I was shedding a few tears, but I was completely in tears and going, it full on got to me, even knowing what was coming. And I dare say it is probably one of the best character deaths in all of television. It is beautiful in its simplicity, because it's not a there are no long drawn out explanations on why he needs to sacrifice himself. No overly dramatic scenes with intense music setting it up. Simply reminding the audience of what the machine does, and then having Marcus find out about the machine, and then one brief shot of him using the machine and simply saying, "I love you." And as I explained, the setup in the previous episode that reminded us of how Marcus felt about Ivanova, that she appreciated, set it up so perfectly. For this scene, it was absolutely amazing. I'm getting teary-eyed just talking about it. So that was one of the most powerful endings to an episode that I've ever seen. And this was overall one of the best hours of television in existence ever. So next episode is Rising Star, which was pretty much the epilogue to Endgame that dealt with the aftermath of what happened on Earth. And I love that. I love exploring the consequences of the big action sequences, where a lot of shows and films don't do this because they consider it anticlimactic. But Babylon 5 always makes sure to give those follow-up and closure, even though there's no thread of the week in this episode. There's no big bad guy. It's just showing us the consequences of all these tense episodes that we've been seeing. I love that. This episode begins with the very touching follow-up to Marcus's sacrifice, where we see Ivanova's side of it, and the scene we get of her talking to Franklin and seeing how upset she is that Marcus would sacrifice himself to save her was amazing. To be honest, I've never been that much impressed with the actor who plays Ivanova, but in this scene, she was amazing. This was by far her best performance in the entire show, and it was riveting, simply riveting. It worked so amazingly well. It was so really powerful, so heart-wrenching, so poignant a follow-up to the previous scene. It was amazing. And while the rest of the episode wasn't quite as amazing, it was still fascinating to see Sheridan trick the Earth government that tried to force him into retirement, where technically he does retire from the military, but only to become the president of the new Interstellar Alliance, which does seem to be Babylon 5's version of the Federation. And I loved it. I love how Jakar and Londo were willing to go to bat for him. It was satisfying seeing Sheridan truly triumph as they ensure a new era of peace, even forcing Earth government to recognize Mars' independence. So this was a truly satisfying conclusion to many of the show's ongoing storylines. However, I do have several bones to pick with this episode. First of all, and most importantly, I don't at all buy EarthGov's and the new president's reaction to Sheridan. Now granted, the attitude that they seem to have with all those who supported Clark makes sense. It reminds me of like Nelson Mandela forgiving all the crimes of the apartheid once that had ended. And I totally get how, the new president said that they don't want to just go, full hard and hang everyone who worked for Clark. And they want to separate those who simply did what they needed to do out of fear for their lives from those who were complicit in Clark's actions. But that being said, Sheridan should full on be considered a hero, and there is no doubt, no debate, none whatsoever that Sheridan did the right thing. More than that, more than doing the right thing, he removed an evil dictator from power who was guilty of genocide. And instead of grabbing power from himself, which frankly would actually be his right by any measure to do, he gives it back to the civilian government. He should be celebrated as the greatest hero currently living today, period. This whole thing about Rozhenko saying, oh, well, half of the generals want to kiss you and give you a medal, and the other half want you executed. Well, this is actually really simple. Those generals that want Sheridan executed are war criminals and should be locked away in a dark cell for the rest of their fucking lives. It's that fucking simple. The whole thing about Rozhenko and the others saying, oh, you did the right thing, but in the wrong way, is a bunch of steaming hot bullshit. Those ungrateful shits should be on their knees thanking Sheridan for saving their asses and begging for his forgiveness. Now, I know some may be saying, well, that's no one's saying that they're right, but they're petty politicians. And that's politicians for you, so it's realistic. But I don't buy that. Sorry. That's not typical petty politicians. That's moronic. That is moronic to the extent that I do not buy for a second. Yes, separate those who were forced into helping Clark under the threat of death, but even anyone who is supporting him in any way, anyone who took up arms against Sheridan, are war criminals. They deserve to rot in a dark, dank cell for the rest of their lives. Now, this whole BS about how Sheridan took up arms against his own people, no, he didn't. He rightfully, lawfully fought back against a bunch of criminals listening to the illegal orders that never should have been obeyed, and anyone whom he killed was a war criminal who deserved to die. My opinion, of course, but I feel very strongly about this, and I could go on, but I think I made my point. So the whole thing about Sheridan being treated like this felt like a very fake and artificial way to create tension. Again, just my opinion. Anyway, I have a couple of other nitpicks about this episode. First is in this episode, Jakar talks about the League of Non-Allied Worlds as if they comprise all of the races on Babylon 5, but that is clearly not the case. It was established in the first season that the main council on Babylon 5 consists of 5 major superpowers: humans, Minbaris, Centauri, the Narn, and the Vorlons. And all the other races who didn't have as much power, who weren't considered one of the 5 superpowers, were represented by one organization called the League of Non-Allied Worlds. That's why they were non-allied, because they're not aligned with the humans, they're not allied with the Minbari, they're not allied. You get my point. So basically, all these tiny little worlds that have nowhere near as much power as the Earth or Minbar joined together and formed this league. So basically, they all had collectively one vote, where each of the 5 superpowers each had one vote as well. Now, you may find this a bit unfair, but that's simply how it's been established. And the idea of having these non-allied worlds that are so tiny and don't have that much power, so they have to pool together, and when they pool together as one organization, they have power equal to the superpowers. That's a concept that makes sense to me. Now, at this stage, however, the Vorlons are revealed to be these magical fairies, and they disappeared across the Undying Lands, and the Narn have been severely crippled by the occupation and barely have any power left, and Earth, of course, are recovering from being ruled by an evil dictator. But it doesn't change the fact that the Narn and the Minbari are not members of the League of Non-Allied Worlds, like Jakar implies. And he states that they are, which I know it's a minor nitpick, but it really annoys me. But what also annoys me even more is the ending, where Jakar puts his eye in Sheridan and Delenn's honeymoon suite so he can watch them fuck. I'm sorry, but that is creepy. It makes me feel very icky watching that, but don't get me wrong, I still love this episode, and it was an amazingly great way to wrap up the season. But it wasn't, in fact, the last episode of the season, as that honor goes to the next episode, the Deconstruction of Falling Stars. Now, in my intro on part 1 of this review, I mentioned there was only one episode this season which I would call bad or subpar, and it is this one. And to be fair, this really isn't a Season 4 episode, as it was made during the production of Season 5, which is why Ivanova wasn't in this episode, as she had left the show for Season 5. So really, this is a Season 5 episode, but it was aired as part of Season 4. Now, as I mentioned, JMS heard that the show was being canceled after Season 4, so even though he had 2 years left in his 5-year plan, he crammed those 2 years into one season so he could finish his 5-year plan. But it turned out that Babylon 5 did get a Season 5, but by this time they had already filmed all of Season 4, which went to the end of JMS's 5-year plan. So this episode was made in retrospect after they knew there would be a Season 5, as a way to try to set up for that season. Originally, the episode Sleeping in Light was meant to be the episode that followed Rising Star, and it was meant to be the finale of Season 4, but it was also written as the final episode of the entire show. So when it was learned that the finale of Season 4 would not be the final episode of the show, it was then withheld and saved to be the final episode of Season 5, so it could be the final episode of the show. And I totally and completely disagree with this decision and think that they should have went ahead and aired this episode anyway and just treated season 5 like an appendix, just like they did with all those TV movies, because that's basically what it is anyway. In fact, had I not felt obligated to watch it in this order for these reviews, I would have watched Sleeping in Light after Rising Star and not even bothered with season 5. And if I ever watch this show again, that's what I'll do, as I think that episode makes a lot more sense in this order. But I'll get more into that when I cover that episode in season 5. As far as the deconstruction of falling stars goes, this episode sucks. It's basically a bunch of short stories having the theme of those who misremember history or twist it to serve their own purposes. But as a story itself, it doesn't work, and I really didn't like seeing thousands of years into the future. This devalues the story, in my opinion. Getting the storyline with the news, the reporting, the reporters, the talking heads bickering at each other on the news program was a bit too realistic. Felt like I was watching Fox News, so I didn't really like it. The academia debate was, by JMS's own admission, a stab at certain academics, and it felt more like an attack piece and didn't feel realistic at all. Now, the thing with the evil dudes in the future recreating holograms of the Babylon 5 crew in order to paint them as evil, only to be tricked by the Garibaldi hologram, was pretty interesting. I did kind of like that, but it's still a bit silly. And the stuff with the Earth thousands of years into the future, where they've gone back to like medieval times level of technology, that was boring and stupid. I didn't like it. And don't even get me started. Don't even get me started on that superhumans millions of years in the future. The less I say about that, the better. Anyway, bad episode. So, that is all the episodes of Season 4, so now it's time for me to name my favorite and least favorite episodes of Season 4. So let me start with my least favorite episode, and I'm not even going to bother naming like any other contenders, because it was very clearly the deconstruction of falling stars. No other episode even came close. Although, to be fair, this isn't really a Season 4 episode. It's really a Season 5 episode. So if I was going to go with an actual Season 4 episode, it would be Line of Communication, the episode with the Drock. But I think that episode wasn't all that bad, and it was way better than the deconstruction of falling stars, which was by far the worst. And since it is officially in Season 4, I will have to say it is the worst episode of Season 4. Now, as for the best episode of Season 4, this was a lot harder. There were a lot more contenders like Moments of Transition, No Retreat, No Surrender, The Face of the Enemy, Between the Darkness and the Light, and Rising Star. But I'm going to have to say that the best episode of the season was Endgame. And it still feels really weird for me to say that. But Endgame, at least Babylon 5's Endgame, I feel I need to specify that, it was amazing. One of the most intense and engaging pieces of fiction that I've ever seen, and had an ending so emotionally powerful it had me in tears every time I watch it. An absolute masterpiece. So as for my rating for Babylon 5 Season 4 as a whole, out of 10, I think I'm going to have to give it a 10, the best. Now, this may surprise some people, as I didn't really care for the way the Shadow War was resolved, and I had some issues throughout the season, particularly in the start of the season, but a 10 isn't a perfect score, particularly when applied to whole seasons, as there's no such thing as a perfect season of television, as every season has its ups and downs. Yes, even Breaking Bad. For a 10, for a TV season, means it's among the best years of television I've ever seen. And Season 4 of Babylon 5 certainly qualifies for this. It means that its highs were so high that it dwarfs its lows, which weren't really that low, which is most certainly the case for Season 4. For its Earth Rebellion storyline, was absolute pure gold. So that's it for my review of Season 4 of Babylon 5. I'll be back in about a month for my review of Season 5 of Babylon 5, so make sure you check out my channel for that, as well as many other videos I do on other shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek, The Expanse, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.